This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of World to Win. I'm Toya, part of the International Socialist Alternative, and of course, I have my co-host Yara. Today, we have a really exciting episode, but before we get into it, I just want to remind everyone to subscribe to our channel. We're almost at 2,000 subscribers, and so we want to make sure that people are sharing our channel, sharing our videos, so hit the bell to make sure you know when we're posting new content, which we do weekly. And next week, we are going to be taking a week off because the International Socialist Alternative has our virtual Marxist University. Now, this event is only for members of our organization, but if you want to participate, you should join us, and you can sign up on our website. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what country you're in, you can join and be a part of the International Socialist Alternative. And for those of you that are members and haven't registered, make sure you do so. The deadline is coming up. So I'm going to kick it over to Yara. How have you been, Yara? How's your week been?
I'm good. It's been a very busy week. We have so many events internationally. It's so interesting, but I'm particularly looking forward to tonight because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, but a little bit of a nerd about it, and it's the revolutions in North Africa and the Middle East in 2011. So it seems like it was only yesterday, but it's been a whole decade since the Arab Spring. So I think it's really important that we kind of look back, see what happened there, where we are now, and what lessons need to be learned. So I'll just give us a brief introduction before we go into the discussion about this. So some of us may remember it started with a Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire because of the deep levels of poverty in the country and also police harassment. And this kind of became a trigger that lit the entire region on fire. It was there were already protests going on at the time, but this was what triggered the mass movement. Obviously, there was so much to protest against. At first, those movements started in Tunisia and in Egypt, but they soon kind of spread across the Middle East, across North Africa, and we saw mass protests and what was later named the Arab Spring. Now, the dictatorships in the Middle East and the Maghreb trembled when they looked at the millions and so many people out on the streets fighting against them, fighting against the corruption, against poverty, against unemployment, and against the repressive states that they were in. And I think these are events that as socialists we have to look at and analyze and also learn from. So in order to do that, we have Cédric from the ISA International Executive here with us. And he's also the author of a book on the 10th anniversary of those revolutions. It's brand new. We're going to talk about it a little bit later. But you also may know him as JJ. So, hey, JJ, how are you doing?
Hi, Yara. I'm very good. And you?
I'm good. So I'm going to go straight in and ask you the most difficult question, I think. I know you were on the ground when that happened. So can you tell us a little bit about how it was and what you think was so important about those first kind of movements that started in that region?
Well, I mean, in my view, the significance of these developments and the importance of revisiting them cannot be overstated. I mean, I would argue that the revolutionary process initiated in 2010 and 11 in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, where, the first revolutions of the 21st century, in reality, that's their historical significance. It was a decisive turning point in the world situation at the time. And, socialists have always taken very seriously the task of studying past revolutions, not because we think, that history repeats itself in exactly the same way or anything, but because they contain extremely valuable lessons that can assist us in today and tomorrow's battles. But also because going back to these events allows us to, lift a veil on many things the ruling class wants us to forget today. I mean, look at the new US President Joe Biden, for example, like all the imperialist leaders of the time. He was firmly on the side of, tyranny, publicly defending Mubarak as not a dictator. And considering how human rights are likely to be an important thrust in his foreign policy in the next period, it's always good to kind of refresh our memories about this kind of thing. Now, on a personal level, it was certainly a very, exhilarating experience to be thrown in this in the Tunisian revolution. but also, I would say, a learning school of practice like no other. It was as if, a concentrate of all the Marxist books I had read before were suddenly thrown in my face. Revolution was not anymore just something to talk or to read about. It was right in front of me, and it was, deadly serious as well. So Lenin's famous phrase that an ounce of experience is worth a ton of theory, took for me a completely new dimension.
Wow, I can't even imagine what it was like. I remember that I was living in my home country in Israel at the time, and I remember when that started breaking and like going on in Tunisia and in Egypt, we were talking amongst us saying maybe we should just take a bus and go to Egypt and see what's happening there. Like obviously we couldn't do that, but it was just so exciting to even hear about it next door. So I can't even imagine how it was like to actually be there. And speaking of being there in Tunisia, we also have Aymen, who is a member of the Tunisian section of the International Socialist Alternative, and he's recorded for us a little bit about the events that took place and also the victories and the failures and what we can learn from it. So it's going to be really interesting to hear. So let's hear from Aymen.
Camarades, salutations révolutionnaires de la part de la section tunisienne d'Alternative Socialiste Internationale. Il y a quelques jours, que le peuple tunisien a célébré le 10e anniversaire de la révolution tunisienne. Le slogan central de cette révolution était « Travail, liberté et dignité ». Elle est restée le slogan le plus populaire jusqu'à ce jour, car les aspirations contenues dans le slogan n'ont pas été réalisées. 10 mois après la chute de Ben Ali, le parti islamiste réactionnaire, ce qu'on appelle parti Nahda, a profité du vide politique pour gagner les élections et a dirigé un gouvernement pendant 3 ans. Ce gouvernement a fait face d'une résistance populaire importante dès ses débuts, qui s'est accélérée en 2013. Avec le meurtre par les islamistes des 2 dirigeants de gauche, Choukri Belaïd et Mohamed Brahmi. Après ces événements horribles, la Tunisie fut succédée par des protestations et des grèves de masse. En parallèle, la droite libérale et les éléments liés à l'ancien régime ont cherché un nouveau cadre politique pour s'opposer aux islamistes, tout en préservant le système en place, en créant un nouveau parti appelé Nida Tunis. C'est l'appel de Tunisie, ça signifie l'appel de Tunisie. Malheureusement, la coalition de gauche du Front populaire, au lieu de donner une direction au mouvement révolutionnaire, s'est alliée à Nida Tunis pour former ensemble le front de Satti national contre les islamistes. Mais par la suite, Nida Tunis, ou bien le parti L'Appel de Tunis, a fait une alliance secrète avec les islamistes pour diviser le pouvoir après les élections de 2014. L'alliance entre le Front populaire et Nida Tunis fut la grande erreur historique de la gauche tunisienne et marque le début d'une crise profonde des principales organisations de gauche qui composaient le Front populaire, la gauche stalinienne, maoïste, nationaliste ainsi que les dites trotskistes de la 4e internationale. Cette crise de la gauche dure jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Durant les 10 dernières années, le pays a vu un nombre impressionnant de grèves régionales, générales, du secteur public, du secteur privé, des États et des manifestations de la part des jeunes, des étudiants, des chômeurs, des travailleurs et des femmes travailleuses. Donc, mais la raison pour laquelle le capitalisme a réussi à survivre durant toutes ces années est relative à la question de quel programme et quelle direction sont donnés au mouvement des travailleuses. et des travailleurs. À peu près 1 million de travailleurs sont affiliés à la grande organisation syndicale des travailleurs tunisiens, ce qu'on appelle le GTT. C'est une grande force dans le monde arabe, dont la base a joué un rôle clé dans le processus révolutionnaire. En 2010-2011, il y a aussi la révolte contre le régime islamiste en 2013. Mais malheureusement, il est manipulé par une couche centrale bureaucratique, le bureau exécutif, qui joue sans cesse le rôle de pompier pour éteindre l'élite et tourne le dos aux revendications des masses populaires. Dans ces conditions caractérisées par une crise de direction de mouvement syndical et révolutionnaire, le phénomène du populisme aussi visible à l'échelle mondiale a explosé sur la scène politique tunisienne lors des élections de 2019. Le populisme est incarné par le président actuel de la République tunisienne, qu'il a gagné les élections présidentielles sur la base d'une campagne avec comme slogan central « Le peuple veut ». Mais qui est le peuple? Et qu'est-ce qu'il veut exactement? Sont des questions restées sans réponse. Aujourd'hui, le régime de la soi-disant transition démocratique en Tunisie traverse une crise généralisée et qui s'aggrave de jour en jour. Une crise politique, crise de pouvoir présidentiel, de pouvoir parlementaire et de pouvoir gouvernemental. 9 gouvernements se sont suicidés depuis la chute de Ben Ali, y compris 3 dans les dernières années, et 381 ministres se sont répartis des postes dans les différents ministres. L'instabilité politique a frappé tous les partis de droite, libéraux, islamistes et tous ceux qui ont participé à la gouvernance du pays dans les 2 dernières années. C'est aussi une grave crise économique et sociale. Les conditions de vie s'aggravent. Du jour en jour, l'inflation grimpe, les aliments de base coûtent de plus en plus cher. Le taux de chômage, les inégalités régionales sont encore pires que sous la dictature. Plus de 200 000 travailleurs ont perdu leur emploi l'année dernière et les familles, les pauvres, les marginalisés, les travailleurs n'en peuvent plus de vivre de cette manière. Ces conditions mettent au clair le fait que tant que le pouvoir politique reste subordonné au capital mondial et tunisien, il ne peut jamais offrir autre chose que plus de souffrance pour la majorité de la population. Pourtant, cette souffrance ne reste jamais très longtemps sans réponse. Cette année déjà, la plus dynamique en termes de protestations sociales et économiques, avec 8000 protestations enregistrées. Mais depuis vendredi dernier, on a vu un grand éclatement de nouvelles protestations qui sont parties de la ville de Sudan, mais se sont rapidement répandues dans tous les pays avec 10 batailles de rue, jour et nuit, et tous les quartiers sortent dans la rue pour dire stop au pouvoir en place, stop à toute classe politique corrompue, stop à la répression policière, à la misère et au mode de vie qui nous est imposé par le capitalisme.
Afraid. The unrest was originally sparked when police prevented an unemployed graduate from selling fruit without a license, and he set fire to himself, dying shortly afterwards of his burns. Although security forces were told yesterday to show restraint, things rapidly got out of hand. It's unclear how many people have been killed over the past month. Officials say 23 people have lost their lives, but some human rights groups say more than 60 people have been killed.
mais le pur outil pour essayer d'empêcher le mouvement actuel est venu de la bureaucratie centrale de l'UGTT qui est sortie avec une déclaration publique pour demander un arrêt des violences et des manifestations qu'elle présente comme des émeutes. Les militants d'Asie en Tunisie participent réellement et virtuellement aussi dans ces manifestations pour tenter d'organiser le mouvement sur la base des points programmatiques clairs orientés vers les militants de gauche, vers l'organisation syndicale et surtout vers les masses. Nous avons besoin d'un mouvement révolutionnaire avec la classe des travailleurs en première ligne. C'est pourquoi nous levons des slogans visant à posséder les travailleurs vers une vraie solidarité avec les jeunes, les marginalisés, les étudiants et à amener leurs revendications de le mouvement aussi. Nous appelons à la formation des comités d'autodéfense et de coordination locale pour structurer, défendre et enraciner le mouvement dans toutes les localités du pays. Et nous pensons qu'il faudrait étendre le mouvement vers un mouvement de grève générale nationale. En solidarité avec le mouvement en cours pour la libération de tous les protestataires arrêtés, mais aussi pour un programme urgent, un programme social d'urgence afin de garantir un emploi, des salaires et des conditions de vie décentes pour tous. Bien sûr, nous n'attendons rien du gouvernement actuel et nous comprenons aussi que les masses en Tunisie ne peuvent pas sans arrêt voir chaque gouvernement être remplacé par un autre gouvernement qui mène exactement les mêmes politiques. Tous les gouvernements successifs après la révolution représentent la continuation des politiques menées avant la révolution car ils reposent sur les bases du même système, c'est le capitalisme. Dans ces conditions seules, un programme de rupture avec ce système et pour une alternative socialiste internationale, une alternative socialiste révolutionnaire en Tunisie et dans toutes les régions peut garantir le succès de la révolution commencée il y a 10 ans. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
So now we have a video from Satti in Sudan, who's going to explain what's going on currently, the current situation. But unfortunately, we cannot show their face because of security reasons. So make sure you are listening extra closely for this next segment.
The revolutionary uprising against the Bashir regime was not an isolated episode, but part of the general revolution process shaking North Africa and the Middle East since 2010-2011. And also the continuation of previous rounds of struggles against the Sudanese dictatorship. It was not just to demand political freedom, but to end wars and economic misery and transform people's condition of life. For example, the immediate trigger of the movement was the tripling of the prices of bread by the regime. The heroic efforts and mass mobilizations of the Sudanese masses led to the overthrow of the head of the regime in April 2019, but the masses understood that the whole regime had to fall. So further revolutionary mobilizations continued in the aftermath against the military branch which had hijacked this initial victory. Intense phases of revolution and counter-revolution developed in the subsequent months. A 2 days long general strike at the end of May, followed by a counter-revolution offensive, large-scale massacre by the military regime and its militia on the 3rd of June. But this massacre did not break the movement. Another 3 days long general strike shocked the whole country 1 week later. Unfortunately, those who were in leadership positions in the movement, in particular the leader of the Sudanese Professional Association, instead of relying on the strength of the movement in the street and the workplaces to finish off the old regime, betrayed the inspirations of the revolutionary people. This peace, despite having initially demanded a handover of power to a civilian government, they eventually agreed to a power-sharing deal with the military council in August 2019, letting old regime leading figures, generals, and militia bosses in a position of control. This led to the formation of a transitional government and of a sovereign council headed by the very same people responsible for the search of John massacres and for many others crimes against the Sudanese population. But by its very nature, this government has shown itself incapable of addressing the demands of the December revolution because it is unwilling to confront the interests of the military, with which it is sharing the management of the country, and the capitalist elite at the large picture. The result is that for the overwhelming majority of the population today, life has not fundamentally changed. Freedom, peace, and justice have still to be fought for. And despite the official peace agreement declared last year, violence still raged in Darfur region and many other parts of Sudan, with murders on civilian and enormous costs for the local population, most especially women and children. The country continued to be run for the interest and benefit of a corrupt wealthy minority, while workers, peasants, and poor people conditions are getting worse day by day. Inflation has jumped past 200% in recent months. Wages cannot keep with the increase in prices, and there are widespread shortage of essential goods like oil, bread, and medicine. The same labor laws are still in effect, and many workers have been dismissed because of fighting for their rights. Strikes have taken place in a number of sectors over the last year. For example, the doctor strike last November to demand permanent contract, and the Kinani sugar factory workers strike also. And these workers demanded basic trade union rights, increasing wages, the removal of figures associated with the old regime from the company, and the reinstatement of workers sacked for taking part in the uprising. Besides these workplace struggles, there have been other important protests, such as like those demanding justice for those who lost their life during the revolution, and also they protest against the impunity of the criminal power, the criminals in the power. Unfortunately, at the moment there is no political force organizing the growing discontent in society into a cohesive movement of struggle and revolutionary change. The SPA and the Sudanese Communist Party leadership have become cut off from the working class and poor people. they are not actively campaigning for a clear alternative to the government policies. And because of this, the reactionary Islamists are trying to take advantage of the growing popular discontent and of the political vacuum to regain ground among the people and attack the government from a right-wing religious perspective. And this shows that the urgency for a genuinely left-wing alternative to be built in Sudan to renew with the real demand that were at the head of December revolution, and to organize a struggle in the communities, workplaces, unions, faculties, from a clear class-based perspective. In the meantime, the geopolitical rivalry of Sudan, seeking better relations with the US imperialism and its allies in the region. And it's going full speed. The normalization agreement with the reactionary Israeli regime is a part of this process. We reject this normalization with an occupying power, which is nothing but a normalization of occupation itself. And of the ongoing national operation of Palestinian masses. And this agreement, rejected by the vast majority of Sudanese people, was the result of a direct blackmail from Washington, with the removal of Sudan from its list of state sponsors of terrorism. Use it as the tool of this blackmail. Most of the Sudanese political parties had initially rejected the general push to normalize relations with the Israeli regime at that time. And they announced, as they announced last year, and they saying they would form an opposition front against this agreement. But in the end, their opposition has come to nothing, and they have to de facto accept it. The way this normalization process have been sold to the Sudanese people is by pricing all the economic benefit it will supposedly bring to Sudan. But recently, Israel, I think in October, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had made clear who will benefit from it. Welcome the normalization, and I quit for good for our pocket. Meaning good for the pocket of Israeli business tycoons and the Israeli ruling class. The US capitalists are also hoping to reap the benefit of this agreement. Last week, Sudan has signed a memorandum of understanding with the US Export-Import Bank to facilitate American export into Sudan. And it's being said that this agreement will help Sudan on the path toward debt relief. But in reality, the cancellation of the $60 billion of Sudan foreign debt contracted during the years of dictatorship is not part of this agreement. And by unblocking loans from the World Bank, this agreement will only ensure the continuation of Sudan debt traveling and force the debt repayment at the expense of millions of Sudanese who are already suffering from a devastating economic crisis. This, along with the continuing monopoly of the Sudanese economy by a group of banks and corrupt military officials, will continue to prevent the massive public investment needed in the field of education, health infrastructure, and the real development. Sudan debt also include massive errors to the IMF. The same IMF which is talking about the need for further painful reforms in Sudan, and say there is a broad agreement with the Sudanese authority on this reform. This will mean more removal of subsidy, wage cuts, and other anti-poor policies in the future. And this clearly shows that this normalization process and the so-called Abraham Accords are not being done for the benefit of the Sudanese people as it's claimed, and even less for the sake of Palestinian people which struggle is once again stabbed in the back by the reactionary regime of the region. And this is being done for the sake of the international financial institutions and creditors to facilitate big business deals between all countries involved, and for the prestige of Israeli and US imperialism, including Netanyahu and Trump person. In the last, just want to say socialists and the ISA reject such anti-democratic maneuvers, concluding among various gangs of war criminals. We fight instead for international solidarity, for working class and oppressed masses of all nations, for peace, for full equal democratic rights, and for a society free of poverty, economic exploitations, and oppressions of all sorts. Thanks, comrades, my solidarity.
Thanks, Aymen, so much for that. It's so important that we get to hear on the ground experience of things that happen around the world. And that's what's so great about being a part of the International Socialist Alternative. We can learn from each other, we can hear from each other. So I encourage you to get involved if you haven't already. But I'm going to switch a little bit to talk more about what happened in Sudan, because of course we know that the effects of what happened in 2010, 2011 didn't just end once these uprisings ended. There was I don't want to say a legacy, but there was a trend that continued in the region over time and actually around the world, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But in 2019, people may remember what was happening in Sudan. There were months of rebellion, sit-ins at military headquarters. Workers and farmers and young people were fighting to end the dictatorship, a 30-year dictatorship. And it was sparked because of a rise in the price of grain, which made bread very expensive. And people couldn't afford, basic necessities that we need every day. And we saw the effects of these international institutions like the IMF forcing, countries that can't afford to pay back debts, forcing them to pay back these debts. And so these governments have to implement oppressive austerity in order to be able to fulfill these debts to these institutions that very much don't need the money. But what was so exciting about the rebellion and revolution in Sudan was the role that young women actually were playing. They were a huge role setting up grassroots neighborhood committees to organize the resistance. And it was a very, very inspirational thing to watch. I encourage people to check out the International Socialist Alternative's website to read on the ground reporting and our analysis of the time. But I want to ask JJ to talk a little bit more about the effect that this had across the region more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that a revolution is always very undisciplined, you might say, in the sense that it never stays in one place. In fact, the international reverberation of these struggles has been one of the most essential characteristics from the very beginning, because the masses suddenly became aware across national borders of the similarity of their conditions, but also of their potential power to revolt against these conditions. And that's why it spread out so quickly. But it's important to emphasize that the echoes of these revolutionary waves were not constrained to that region. So, for example, in February 2011, the Chinese regime and its internet police tightened online censorship on the basis of a list of banned words that included Jasmine Revolution, which was, the nickname given by some foreign journalists to the Tunisian revolution. So many authoritarian regimes across the world were petrified of the inspiration that these events were provoking among millions of workers and oppressed around the world. I mean, weeks after Mubarak's downfall, a mass workers' struggle erupted in Wisconsin, in the United States, against attacks on public sector workers and their unions, with banners and placards explicitly referring to the revolution in Egypt. And it actually went, both ways. I mean, a picture was published, for example, at the time on social media of a young man in Egypt holding up a sign reading, "Egypt support Wisconsin workers, one world, one pain." And I would say that, this understanding that the suffering of one people in one corner of the planet is the suffering of all, that is, that it's resulting from the same world system. That is an idea that I believe has grown even stronger in the context of the, today's triple economic, climate, and health disaster we are now confronted with. But to go back to 2011, the same year, the Occupy Wall Street movement also erupted. The Indignados movement broke out in Spain, in Greece, and other countries. So it kind of really kicked off a wind of global revolt. And we saw something very similar, even deeper actually, in 2019, with mass revolts breaking out in Chile, Hong Kong, Iran, global climate strikes and marches everywhere. And the mutual inspiration of these movements was, absolutely evident. And I think also that, the international features of capitalist development of the last several decades, notably the advent of new technologies and so on, have strengthened in reality the material basis for these sorts of internationalism in struggle for the future.
Yeah, I remember that time. It was so incredible to see how kind of like it started in one spot and it just spread across the globe. And I think it's kind of like that famous saying of sometimes things don't happen for decades and then decades happen in weeks. It was just that. It was every day we woke up to see something else happening. It was amazing. And I want to ask, because I've heard a little rumor, actually, Toya, that you were involved in the Occupy movement that was happening at the same time, that was part of this global movement. And I also heard that you even joined the organization during those protests. So I want you to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, it was a crazy time. I had just graduated college a few years prior, and none of my friends had jobs in the fields that we had studied. So everyone's like working in restaurants, traveling, and the Occupy movement happened. And I was actually working in a restaurant near the where the Occupy in my city was, and it was a crazy time because it was the first time really that this term, the 1%, was really mainstream, and everyone was naming who the enemy was. And I think that really radicalized a lot of, college graduates like myself about like, wait a minute, my mom didn't lose her house because she's bad at finances. It's because of this crisis that we're in. Oh my God, it was mind blowing for a lot of people. And, to see people starting in New York City, just taking over parks, and it spread to universities, and participating in these mass meetings where, the whole mic check thing was like the first time I see it, where you say mic check, and then the people in the back scream mic check, and then you repeat back and forth. It was just this organic way of all of us communicating when there's hundreds of us around to figure out what it is that we need to do. It was a crazy time. And yes, I joined the International Socialist Alternative during this time, as did many people who, have been on our show at this time. It was a very, it was a radicalizing experience for many of us. But as JJ was saying, it wasn't just happening in the US, it was happening all over the world. And so you were in Israel during this time. What was it like? What was it like there?
I think what you're saying like really connects to my experience during the time. Like I was, I think 15 or 16 while those protests started. I was already a member. I think I joined about 3 months before the protests in Tunisia started. And it was mind blowing because, it was, I think a lot of people in the world, like you said, were radicalized during that time and like a little bit before that time. And it was so amazing to see what was happening everywhere. Like everyone was talking about it, and everyone was talking about it, you know, in such a different way that I'd experienced before, because obviously Israel doesn't look in the Middle East and North Africa in a good way a lot of the times in the media and the mainstream. And it was so amazing to see, even on the streets, you had solidarity with the people that were fighting against their government. And soon after, Israel kind of joined that movement. And in July, there started being like mass protests. It started with kind of like protest against the rising cost of living, and especially rent. And what happened is there was a little protest organized. Someone just took a tent to the main avenue in Tel Aviv and sat in that tent, said, I'm not paying rent anymore. This is extortionate, can't do this. And within a few days, the entire avenue, this is one of the biggest avenues in Tel Aviv, was filled with tents of young people just saying, enough is enough. We can't afford to pay that. Like, just for context, between 2007 and 2011, the rent price and the prices of apartments generally and housing prices rose by 38.5% compared to the average salary in the market. So it was unaffordable. It's still unaffordable. So it was amazing to see. And then there started being protests every week. Every Saturday there would be protests, and it started with a few thousands, grew to tens of thousands, and reached 400,000 people. This is up to that point, it was the biggest protests ever in the history of the country. And I remember being out on the street and not being able to call anyone because there was no reception because of how many people were out on the streets. And I think what was the most amazing as a socialist was, like you said, those slogans that came out, the 1%, talking about organized labor. I remember one of the slogans was, organized labor is the way to fix the country. Things like that it's amazing. But also this kind of connected consciousness with the countries in the region that I didn't think I've ever seen before that point. We had, people shouting Mubarak, Assad, Bibi Netanyahu, making that connection very bluntly. And, wages are low, prices are high, we will fight like Egypt. It was always connected to that, and it was so amazing to see. Obviously, we can talk a lot about the way that these movements have progressed and the many failures that they had, but I think that it was the effect they had in radicalizing people who are still active today, and the lessons that we've learned from these protests is invaluable. So yeah, I think it's really, really interesting to hear about how it's literally every place around the world had those same effects.
Yeah, I mean, it's so inspiring to hear about, your experience and other experience. And I encourage people to comment. Let us know, what were you doing during Occupy? Did you participate? Were there occupations, in your cities, in your countries? I think it'd be really cool to see all the different responses, because I'm sure there will be tons of people who participated in some sort of Occupy during this time. But I want to go back to JJ and talk about, the fact that Occupy happened, 10 years ago. The so-called Arab Spring happened 10 years ago. And so can you tell us a little bit more about the situation facing workers and the poor in the Middle East and North Africa today?
Well, I mean, it's always a bit difficult to sum up the picture in a region that is, stretching from Morocco all the way up to the Persian Gulf. But I think if there is one thing most people would probably agree with in virtually every part of the region, is that their fate is actually worse. And I mean here from a very objective material point of view than it was at the beginning of the revolutionary process 10 years ago. There has been a terrible decline in purchasing power, increasing prices, explosion of unemployment rates, deterioration of the quality of already utterly inadequate and decaying services, etc. I mean, the Middle East and North Africa has always been a region of brutal inequalities, but that gap has only grown since. And last year's global recession and COVID crisis has only taken this phenomenon to a new extreme. Now, Tunisia has often been portrayed as a bit of an exception, as a sort of, poster child of the so-called Arab Spring, because there people can talk more openly than in the past. There is, more freedom of expression and so on. And that is an asset from the revolutionary struggle, as Aymen explained. But it's clearly a precarious one. Only last week, to just give one example, and it's one example among many, an activist was sentenced to 4 months in prison for a social media post calling out local public officials for failing to distribute COVID-19 financial aid promised by the government. And he was right to call them out. I mean, since last Friday, the government imposed a new strict lockdown with no serious plan of financial assistance, which, especially in a country where so many people depend on informal activities to make a living, means in effect a condemnation to starve at home. And that's the other side of the coin, if you like. Capitalism, even with a democratic presentation, it's still capitalism. It still means misery, unemployment, and an exploitation for millions. In the last few days, mainstream media and politicians in Tunisia have been denouncing the recent protesters we have seen in the streets as looters and hooligans. Now, in some cases, there were acts of looting, but it's very interesting to see what has been primarily targeted. Food shops and supermarkets. People are taking pasta, eggs, bread, milk, whatever they can grab, because they're simply hungry. A young protester was interviewed on France 24, and he said on camera, if the situation goes on like this, we're going to have to eat each other. And of course, he didn't mean it literally, but it shows the level of economic desperation. In recent opinion polls, 86% of Tunisians said that there was now more freedom to criticize the government. 50% said there were less chances of unlawful arrests. But 81% think the state favors the rich, and 84% believe that the gap between rich and poor has widened in the past decade. And that last sentiment is a sentiment that is there across the whole region. So among 92% of Syrians, among 87% of Yemenis, among 70% of Algerians and Iraqis, among 68% of Egyptians. These are figures from a Guardian YouGov poll, by the way. So the feeling of being economically worse off, of living in significantly more unequal societies today than a decade ago, is present, is entrenched, and it's widespread everywhere. And that's a social time bomb.
Yeah, and I think, we keep talking today, but also generally, I think as socialists, when we look at this period and the revolutions, they're so amazing. And we keep talking about how, it's just incredible what was happening. But like you say, there's still poverty. A lot of the issues that were fought for and a lot of the issues that governments were toppled for are still there. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are different ways to look at this, depending on which class you belong to, basically. I mean, from the point of view of the capitalist classes, their ideologues and all the defenders of the status quo, they would try to present this as an indictment of revolution itself. Basically, look, you want to revolt, that's what you're going to get, worse than before. Was it really worthwhile? And that kind of arguments. Actually, the New York Times just a couple of days ago had an article, and the title was exactly that. It says, in Tunisia, some wonder if the revolution was worth it, which is such a cynical article from a newspaper that probably not so long ago would have praised the democratic model that Tunisia had supposedly become. And at the very moment, people are back on the street with the same slogans that were at the heart of the revolution 10 years ago. These people are turning the narrative around, wondering if it was all worth it. But of course, people don't do a revolution because it's worth it. They do a revolution because society has driven them to a point where they have no other choices. Actually, the Russian revolutionary leader, Leon Trotsky, already replied to such arguments 100 years ago in his book, History of the Russian Revolution, when he asked, do the consequences of a revolution justify in general the sacrifices it involves? The question is theological and therefore futile. It would be as well to ask, in face of the difficulties and griefs of personal existence, is it worthwhile to be born? From our point of view, the fact that the conditions facing the masses are worse than before are an indictment not of revolution, but of capitalism, which has shown to be, structurally, organically incapable of providing anything better for the millions who live in the region than more of the same or worse. And in the rare cases where you might argue that the situation is in some limited aspects a bit less bad than before, like in Tunisia, it's only the result of what the masses have fought on the streets and of a more organized workers' movement, which has warded off the attempt by the ruling class to engage in a more violent counter-reaction. So, we have to be clear. The current conditions are not the result of the revolutionary struggles themselves. They are the very opposite of that. They are the result of the counter-revolution. They are the price the masses today have to pay for not having brought these struggles to a successful conclusions. Now, of course, in countries where this price has been particularly heavy, like in Syria, where substantial portions of the country have been bombed to the ground, where 500,000 people have lost their lives, over half of the population has been displaced, etc. Of course, the idea of revolution has probably been pushed back for a protracted period of time. There is a widespread feeling of defeat, of exhaustion, grief, a daily struggle for survival in very grim conditions, etc. But the brutal reality is that capitalism will have nothing better to offer down the line, apart from more bloodbath, more oppression, more misery. And it's what Lenin said: capitalist society is and has always been horror without end. And in that sense, Syria, like Yemen or Libya, which have all been torn apart by wars and imperialist meddling, are stark warnings for all of us, because there will be more Syrias, there will be more Yemens in the future, unless the left and the workers' movement get their act together and overthrow this system. Having said that, Marxists, are generally by nature quite optimistic people. And one important lesson of the events of the last decade, in my view, is that no amount of bloodshed is an absolute, unlimited deterrent against the eventual revival of resistance and struggle. I mean, Satti, the comrade from Sudan, related to the 3rd of June massacre. I mean, the scale of the atrocities committed on that day are sickening. They pulled tens of bodies out of the Nile River. There were shocking stories surfacing of extreme torture and rape, etc. But as he explained, there was a several days long general strike just a week after that massacre. Sudan is actually a country that has a past of bloody military dictatorships and several cycles of terrible wars, etc. But it has also experienced 3 revolutions in less than 60 years. Let's not forget that all the countries which have experienced mass uprisings in 2019, like Iraq, Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, they all had gone through civil wars in the relatively recent past, and all have been written off by most mainstream commentators as potential candidates for revolutionary explosions. And all these people have been proved wrong by history.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting when you look at this region that is, historically has, like you said, a lot of sectarian violence, a lot of just general issues with the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And you see that people are still fighting and haven't stopped. I think we talked about it quite a lot, that people haven't stopped fighting after 2011. People haven't stopped fighting even when the governments were toppled down. And they won't stop fighting until we really take down the system that, like you said, is the cause of the bloodshed, is the cause of poverty, and not the revolutions that are fighting against it. But because people are still going to fight and are fighting not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but also all around the world, what do you think the biggest lessons that we as activists around the world and workers around the world need to learn from that amazing period of revolutionary struggle?
Well, I think that's a very, an extremely important question, actually. And I think we should look at, what lessons also the masses in the region themselves through the struggle have learned. Because, if from an objective point of view, you could argue that, the balance sheet of the revolutions is pretty meager, from the point of view of the masses consciousness, it's an entirely different question. The process of revolution and counter-revolution of the last decade has been completely transformative. I mean, if I had to single out one important lesson the masses have kind of taken on board from these struggles, is that they had a taste of their own power, of their own capacity to affect the course of history. And that is a lesson that will be extremely difficult for the ruling classes to wipe out from collective memories. I mean, even the Syrian foreign minister understood this very well already when in an interview with an American journalist already in 2012, he openly admitted, he said, even if you win, it's difficult to rule an angry people. And that's why, even when Syria had degenerated into a sectarian civil war, that the head choppers of ISIS were building their so-called caliphate, that the butcher al-Sisi was crushing the Egyptian revolution in blood, that nearly everybody thought, that the so-called Arab Spring, that's it, that's dead and buried. Our international knew, and we said at the time, that this lesson wouldn't go away so easily and would come back with a vengeance. And that's what happened, with a new wave of uprisings in 2018 and 2019. What was quite striking about that new wave is that you could see that the masses had learned from the previous rounds of struggles. Jumping back on what I was saying about Syria earlier, there is an important lesson that the masses of the region have absorbed from the experience of the conflict in Syria, which became mired in sectarian violence on the basis of both the divide and rule policies of the regime and its regional supporters, and the foreign powers' intervention, support and funding of Sunni jihadist groups, etc. And that is the danger of sectarian divisions and where this can lead to. One of the primary targets of the mass movements in Iraq and Lebanon in 2019, which we discussed in a previous World to Win episode, was precisely sectarianism. Both movements demonstrated a higher understanding and explicit rejection of the danger of sectarianism that had long been used by the ruling elites to divide the people, consolidate their rule, etc. Because precisely because they had witnessed the horrors of what happened in Syria. So that's an important element. Another element is that in general, the masses were less naive about what they were up against. So, for example, the attitude towards the army was very different in Algeria and Sudan compared to what it was in Egypt in 2011. It was notable that protesters in Algeria and Sudan remained on the streets even after their dictator had fallen. So they didn't repeat the mistakes of their Egyptian counterparts who left Tahrir Square after 18 days of protest when Mubarak stepped down. They understood the need to resist a military takeover. So after al-Bashir was ousted and replaced by a military council, the Sudanese protesters chanted, "The first one fell, the second will too." Now all these lessons have been learned on the spot, through the hard school of struggle, but also at the cost of very serious defeats, because the workers and the popular masses did not enter the cycle of revolution 10 years ago with a sort of preconceived plan, nor a strategy on how to defeat their enemy. And that is why, they had on some occasions a taste of their power to influence history. They managed to overthrow a series of tyrants and heads of state and so on. But they have not been able to actually, take power away from the corrupt capitalist ruling elites in the region and to reshape history according to their own interest, according to their own revolutionary aspirations, by rebuilding society on a completely new basis. And for that to happen, and this is in my view, by far the single most important lesson to bring home from this discussion, they need their own independent political tool, a mass revolutionary party that can collect, concentrate, generalize from all these experiences and act as a catalyst to guide the movements of the masses towards the revolutionary socialist transformation of society.
JJ, I want to thank you so much for coming on our show today. This has been an amazing discussion, and I love looking back at history and discussing what happened, but seeing as well how we can take the lessons that we learned then and move them forward. So now it's time for our shout out of the week. And we're not saying goodbye to JJ yet, because the shout out of the week is the launching of a book that he wrote about this very topic. So the title of the book is called "The People Want to Overthrow the System: Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Tunisia." I'm so excited for this to come out, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. If you want a copy, you can order it by sending an email to TunisiaRevBook@hotmail.com. That email will be in the description below, so you can be sure to email for your copy. And you can get it in English, you can get it in French, and you can get it in Dutch. So hopefully you speak or can read one of those languages, or have a friend who can translate it for you, which would be awesome. So yeah, I want to thank you again, JJ, and I'm really excited for your book and to have you on the show again in the future.
Wow, that was so interesting, and I can't wait to get a copy of this book. I know I'm very excited, and I always sound excited, but I am so excited. But I think that is it for us today. Super happy to have done this episode. I think it's so important. I completely agree with what Toya said. It's so important to take a look at what's happened and even if it's the recent history of our movement, and learn from it. I hope you enjoyed. Please, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and click the bell button so you're notified when we go live, and also when we have new episodes coming. Of course, join us. We are always on the ground everywhere in over 30 countries around the world. So no matter where you are, just go on our website and register so you can join us and maybe come to the next Virtual Marxist University. So glad to see everyone, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!